Hello, everyone. My name is Creon Butler, and I'm the director of the Global Economy and Finance program at Chatham House. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's panel discussion on debt distress and the role of recent developments in South Asia, but also what's happening in other key parts of the world, including Africa. And we've got two great experts, and I'll hand over them shortly for some introductory comments. But before doing so, I wanted to make three sort of quick points about the general situation in relation to debt distress. And the first of these is that while we got through the pandemic without a systemic crisis, the situation has clearly worsened since the start of the year, reflecting the knock-on effect of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and measures that had to be taken in response to that. Some emerging and developing economies clearly benefited from higher energy prices, but the majority of countries at risk of debt distress did not. And so now we're facing the combination of the legacy of the pandemic, rising US interest rates and a strengthening dollar, which obviously affects the external debt of many of the countries. It's still very much denominated in dollars or other hard currencies, and also the impact of energy price rises and food price hikes. And this is really potentially toxic. In Africa alone, I think if you look in August, there were some 22 low-income countries either in debt distress or at high risk of debt distress. Second point is that the mechanism for dealing with debt distress, which is the G20 common framework, and this was launched in the autumn of 2020 and was really quite an achievement because it brought together all the members of the G20, but particularly China, together with Western countries, essentially to use the approaches of the Paris Club. China is not a member of the Paris Club, but there was an agreement effectively to use Paris Club approaches to dealing with countries, to helping countries that are in debt distress, to dealing with the question of debt restructuring. It did, however, move incredibly slowly through 2021, and I think at some point, sometimes people thought, it was broken. However, this summer, there was a quite significant movement in relation to Zambia with the agreement by official creditors to provide the assurances to the IMF that the IMF needed in order to agree an extended credit facility. That's then been agreed by the IMF board, and we're now in the process of the official creditors looking at what relief they're going to provide through official debt restructuring. And that's quite a significant movement, and I think reflects, one of the interesting questions is what does it reflect? But it seems to reflect, certainly within China, greater comfort with the approach that's underlying the common framework. However, crucially, the common framework is really only designed to apply to low-income countries, 73 low-income countries. It doesn't formally apply to emerging economies or middle-income economies, some of which we're going to talk about today, particularly in relation to Sri Lanka. Final point really is that when thinking about debt distress, it's really important not to think about it in isolation, because many low-income and emerging economies face considerable need for external finance in the context of the transition to net zero. And as I think will be discussed later, this is very much, for most of them, in relation to the adaptation needs as climate change progresses, but that's alongside the broader transition of the global economy to net zero. And if you think about it, if a country is in debt distress, it's not very much point thinking about how you're going to mobilize private finance, because the overall environment is not one in which private finance is going to be happy coming in. So you really have to deal with the issues of debt distress in order to tackle that need for external financing. And as I say, I hope we'll get into that subsequently. So what we're going to do is, because we badged this event as starting with South Asia, I'm going to move to our first speaker. But before doing that, I just need to highlight a couple of quick points, which are standard for these events. So firstly, the session is on the record. We're going to make a recording, which will be available subsequently. And then after each of the presentations by the two speakers, we'll have a discussion among the panelists, but then we'll open to Q&A from the audience for the final 20-25 minutes or so. And what I'd very much like you to do is post your questions in the Q&A box. If there's time, I may ask you to put your question directly, but if not, I will aim to read it out. And please post questions at any time during the discussion, so you don't have to wait until that final point. And then once I will try and handle as many of those questions as possible, so that we can give everybody a chance to put their points. Excellent. So now I will return to our first speaker, and Gareth Price is Senior Research Fellow in the Asia Pacific Program in Chatham House. So Gareth, over to you for your introductory comments.
Thank you, Creon. Yeah, it's interesting. I'm putting South Asia together because South Asia is one of the least connected parts of the world. And when we think about contagion, we're normally thinking about the spread of risk because of linkages between the countries involved. What we're talking about here is the numerous economic similarities between them, which make them appear vulnerable. I thought I'd start off running through the story of what happened in Sri Lanka, because Sri Lanka clearly was the first country to default for a decade or so, and clearly the most vulnerable within South Asia. The story really goes back to 2009 and the end of the Sri Lankan Civil War. And the government goes on a mission to push GDP in part by borrowing external debt. And so, if you like, it's debt fuel spending, which is fine because GDP started to rise. With the end of the Civil War, tourism started coming in, so it's getting more foreign exchange reserves. It's worth making a point, I guess, that it's external debt that's the troubling one. Domestic debt, if you're borrowing domestically, in the last resort, you can print money. And that's not what the textbooks suggest you should do, and it's inflationary and so forth, but you can do that. If it's the external debt, you need dollars to pay it off. And this is the story of Sri Lanka, which I'll quickly relay. So it's not borrowing money, not necessarily a problem. The next event, if you like, in April 2019, a series of bomb blasts go off in Sri Lanka linked to Islamist terrorists. And what that meant is that tourist numbers started to decline. And so, in particular, Western tourist numbers. And that's a problem because that's a key source of foreign exchange. In the short term, they were replaced by, ironically, Russian and Ukrainian tourists. And you can see that that may crop up later in the tale. Then you have a recurrent theme, and I'll come to the sort of linkages or similarities across South Asia, but one of the linkages is populism. And I know it's a debated term, but I'm using populism in the term spending more than you should given your taxation levels. So the new president comes in, Rajapaksa, on a platform of slashing taxes, which any economist would say this is ill-advised, but it was popular. So he comes to power late in 2019 and starts cutting taxes. And I'll digress a second just to make the point. Sri Lanka's continuously had current account deficits and it's continuously had fiscal account deficits. This has been the history of Sri Lanka, and it's been in trouble before. It hasn't necessarily defaulted, but it's had to turn to the IMF because of this recurrent theme of not taxing enough and importing more than it exports, or more than the foreign exchange it brings in. So things are pretty bad, and then you have the pandemic, at which point tourist numbers stop. So it affects all economic activity as everywhere else in the world, but it also has specific sources of foreign exchange for Sri Lanka, one being tourism, which has stopped, the other one being remittances. And I think remittances are a key part of this story, certainly in the South Asian context. Remittances actually started to rise at the start of the pandemic. The reason being they had to go through official channels. And what this implies is that previous estimates of remittances were vastly underestimates, that much more money was coming back on people's persons. And when they couldn't travel, they had to send it through the official channels. So that's an interesting observation, that remittances sustain or are very important in all of South Asian economies and sustain a few of them. So you take those out and you have a massive problem. Now, so foreign exchange isn't coming in. And so Sri Lanka starts plowing through its foreign exchange reserves to pay for its imports. Then one of the stories of mismanagement, it starts banning imports of goods. And one of the main imports in Sri Lanka is fertilizer. And so the president announced it's going to introduce organic farming. Now, with a lag to the next harvest, that means the agriculture output entirely failed. So instead of importing fertilizer, it's got to import food, which is very problematic. So instead of agriculture being a minor import, it suddenly becomes a much more major import. So you've got a slow car crash. The quote from Hemingway, how did you go bankrupt? 2 ways, slowly at first and then all of a sudden, implies entirely. And the all of a sudden was Russia invading Ukraine. Those few tourists that were left coming from Russia and Ukraine, they weren't there anymore. More importantly, the prices of wheat, palm oil, other foodstuffs as knock-on effects, and in particular fuel, all soared. And the country's running through its foreign exchange reserves not long after it's got through them, and it's defaulted. But the next comments I wanted to make was just to sort of bring out, the aspects of Sri Lanka's story that resonate elsewhere in South Asia. And when I say South Asia, I'm saying in order of risk. Pakistan, Nepal, Bangladesh. India's a little bit different, but it does suffer from some of these issues. Remittances are absolutely vital across the region. I was going to make this good point at the end, but I think I'll sort of fit it in now. As an economist working on South Asia, when that's been my title, there's always been something of an escape valve. That countries have been in trouble before, maybe not all at once, but there have been crises in Sri Lanka in the 20, 25 years of looking at them. Pakistan's had crises, Sri Lanka's had crises, Nepal's had civil war and resultant crises. The crises are not new. What happens is that worker outflows become the escape valve. It gets bad in Pakistan, more Pakistanis go and work in the Gulf, and this is the cycle. The problem during the pandemic was that those opportunities weren't there. But more workers go overseas, then they start sending more money back, and then the situation at home stabilizes. Of late, remittances are hitting record levels. So it would seem that that cycle is still in place, that when things get bad, as they are, people are still finding opportunities overseas, at least if you look at the remittances. Economic mismanagement, there's lots of examples. I'll give you Imran Khan in Pakistan. Russia invades Ukraine, the cost of fuel goes up. Pakistan's a major fuel importer. So what he does is introduce a massive subsidy, which is entirely unaffordable. And it's been widely interpreted as a curveball for his successor, because his successor will have to stop this subsidy and will therefore be unpopular. But there are countless examples like that. And then the external debt, including from China. I think I'll leave the discussion on Chinese debt. I think it's something that we'll come back to. But outside of India, the other countries I mentioned are all getting Chinese debt. And I suppose the one point I would say in relation to Sri Lanka is that this debt was spent on entirely economically unproductive matters. A hotel with a revolving restaurant that doesn't work being the most obvious. A comment on Pakistan and a comment on populism, that if you like, the populist leaders, Nepal had one, Pakistan had one, Sri Lanka had one, they've now gone back to technocrats or more technocratic people. Pakistan's political situation is, I think, really problematic because Imran Khan's left, but he certainly hasn't left quietly. So you've got a whole bunch of political questions, and any adhering to any sort of IMF package and doing these kind of things will be the exact opposite of what Imran Khan has popularly done. But we can turn to that more. I think my final comment, we have targeted this as South Asia. There are many similarities between the countries of South Asia. And there are questions about their ability to continue paying external debts, given their income. At the same time, there's very persuasive statements and articles from each of the other countries that I mentioned, explaining why their position is markedly different from Sri Lanka. But they're all worried. I mean, Bangladesh, I put at the bottom of the list. Its economy is doing pretty well, and it should be fine. But there were many articles in the press here about bans on luxury goods and bans on imports because they're trying to conserve their foreign exchange reserves. It's not that they should be in trouble. It's that they're concerned that if international capital wants to take advantage of higher interest rates in the US, one of the reasons for the external debt is that international capital has been driven into places like Sri Lanka because of low interest rates in the West. And these are the places where it moves to. And then if it gets worried or the opportunities are better in safer havens, it's going to start moving back. So there are fears of market sentiment driving an almost needless crisis that I think is one of the main concerns. If international capital follows my earlier logic and says these are very similar, Sri Lanka's in trouble, Pakistan's happening next, it can become a self-fulfilling and unnecessary prophecy.
Gareth, thank you very much. I mean, it's absolutely fascinating. I had just one quick question. I mean, we'll come back to the general question of China's approach, but just thinking back, when India was in crisis in the early 90s and had an IMF program, it turned out to be completely transformational for the Indian economy. And in a way, although it was desperate at the time, it was one of the things that, because of the reforms it forced, largely underpinned the subsequent Indian economic miracle. Is there any chance that the same positive story could happen in relation to Sri Lanka, or is their kind of whole history of their relationship with the fund and so on quite different?
So look, I mean, it's not the despair, it's the hope that kills me. I mean, when I look at South Asia, it's about the challenge is this one of connectivity. All the studies suggest that if they were better integrated, there are massive economic benefits from this. But instead, they're not. I mean, there are examples, Sri Lanka and India, they're relatively close. But as a region, it's not integrated, and it would be much better off if it was. Whenever Pakistan leader says we should liberalize trade with India, you think, is this one of the opportunities? Could this be, exactly as you say, the moment at which they flip over and say, maybe we should try and work together a little bit, as opposed to talking, emphasizing our sovereignty. Pakistan and India don't get on, but that shouldn't necessarily prevent them from trading with each other. Other countries that don't like each other do trade with each other. I think it was an ADB report of a couple of years ago that came up with a number of 74 billion net benefit of this. They started talking about it. Will it happen? Maybe. It depends how bad it gets, but it could happen. I mean, it's one of the easy wins. If shared economies or multiple economies are in crisis, everyone knows that there's potential benefits from doing so. Does crisis drive it? I doubt it, but it might do.
Great. Excellent. Well, I'm now very pleased to move to our next expert, Anzetso Were, who's a highly experienced development economist and has been working on Africa for, I think, over 12 years, and is also being an advisor to wide range of governments and private sector firms and so on. Anzetso, it's great to welcome you, and over to you for your introductory comments.
Thank you very much, Cleon, and thank you, Pattern House, for having me. I'm just going to go ahead and start with the presentation, because I find visuals tend to help. So just to be clear, I am going to be centering a view from Africa. I hope that the slides are in a format that you can see. Sometimes the Zoom is a bit tricky. So first of all, I think obviously we're all aware of the debt trap narrative and sort of the fallacious assertions of China's larger than life role there. I think, to be clear, from an African perspective, the public debt in Africa is driven by the appetite of African governments. It's largely financed by private creditors, domestic and external. Domestic creditors in particular, I do not think get the level of focus that they should in sort of the debt restructuring, reframing, because for some obviously for Africa as an aggregate, but for some specific countries, they are just considerable. And they're really just not part of the conversation, private creditors generally. I think one should bear in mind that, the debt crisis or COVID-19 occurred when signs of fiscal strain, signs of debt strain, that had already started emerging, essentially because of the borrowing spree that started, I'd say, around 2010, partly informed by the global financial crisis and yield hunters that came, again, and then certainly Africa started opening up. So there's a confluence of factors that sort of led to this very aggressive and quick and rapid increase in debt in Africa. And this, however, was not met with sufficient focus on revenue generation. So I'm one of the economists that actually don't encourage people to look at debt in terms of debt to GDP, because it's a bit of a misnomer. In many countries, your GDP will be growing, but your revenue base and your exports won't. Kenya is a very good example where our debt to GDP has been growing, our revenue to GDP, our export to GDP has been declining for over a decade. So one of the fundamental fiscal structural problems in terms of fiscal sustainability has been revenue to GDP in many countries has not been growing. As a result, the debt carrying capacity has been weakening, even as appetite for debt has increased on both the demand and the supply side. So then obviously during COVID, you got all these debt suspension initiatives, which initially were welcome. Of course, a lot of African countries took advantage of them. But now we're sort of in the aftermath of dealing with a lot of lumpy accumulated debt payments that are squeezing African governments at a time when revenue generation isn't really recovering. If you're looking at, first of all, a general informalization effect that COVID had, where a lot of formal firms either shut down or became informal to cut costs and to survive. But more importantly, the economic growth engines in the country, the private sector has not recovered. So the revenue generation problem isn't going away. So debt suspension sort of pushed the problem forward, but now it's like, well, now we're having to pay and really revenue is where it is. So sort of looking at China specifically, and then I'll get into this later. I mean, we've obviously seen about a 20-year period of very, very aggressive lending, very large buckets, particularly, mega infrastructure projects. And I think now we're going to be seeing, smaller lending, more targeted, and that's internal and external factors. I think often people tend to reduce it to, oh, it's China this or it's Africa this, but it's a blend of factors. Now I'm just going to talk about the debt trap narrative because it's just one of those things that won't go away. It's like a smell that just won't go away, even though there's just no truth to it. Obviously, it's factually inaccurate, and I think I've written on it. Just about everybody I know. But the real problem with the debt trap narrative is that it continues the infantilization of African governments. Any sort of debt crisis is in the context of fiscal choices and fiscal policies that evolve over time. And so this notion that there's a one-dimensional, one person or one country is responsible is a proper infantilization of the people who are responsible for those dockets. More importantly, it creates a basis for pulling back on fiscal responsibilities. And sort of to the next point, the concern from African publics and many experts is not China or anybody else. It's fiscal accountability, fiscal justice, and fiscal transparency. And so when the debt trap narrative that's seated in great power of competition gets all the press, you're essentially sidelining the voices of the people who matter the most, of the people who will be affected by the crisis the most, and it prevents particularly African publics from getting the fiscal accountability that they want from their governments, because everybody's banging on about China. But the biggest thing is that it just pretends that the BRI has had no positive impacts in Africa. And I'm going to get into this, it's like fine, debt has been accumulated. China is a tiny player, as I showed in the previous slide, but it has had positive effects. Let us not forget that. Not all debt, is bad debt. But I think the real thing is just really showing that the governments of Europe and North America are completely out of touch and out of tune in terms of the reality of the ground in Africa. And it sort of seems that the African view doesn't matter, which then informs the appetite for Euro-American strategy of the continent, right? So I'm just going to look at some of the value and challenges. First of all, there has been a reduction in economic inequality due to Chinese transport corridors. I'll put this up on my website, so you'll be able to click in on the links. There are many journal and think tank and academic papers, so they're rigorously done. That has happened. For example, in Kenya, the Thika Road Highway, which linked Nairobi to one of the main outskirts, has actually been seen to do that. There's been a reduction in travel time and energy costs, depending on the type of infrastructure project you were dealing with. The technology transfer has been happening in exchange of development solutions, emphasizing this is both public and private sector. Okay, so if you're looking at how BRI has heralded the entry of Chinese private sector, and I wrote an article on this in SubChina, specifically looking at the unique selling points and advantages on the debt trap narrative, and you can see the quote there from the IMF. Yes, it's had a positive economic and social outcomes, and the effects in terms of the negative effects have been negligible, and I'm now qualifying that by pointing out why that statement is being made. I think first of all, the reality that there have been a lot of positive impacts. Oh, sorry. So I was just going through the economic equality question, the reduction in travel time and energy costs, technology transfer, and I'll try and put in the links that I had on SubChina. The opening of trade channels, as much as people really emphasize the fact that the trade is imbalanced between Africa and China, which is absolutely correct. And that is an ongoing concern for both Africa and China. The reality is that the investment in infrastructure facilitated by BRI is something that other countries, including European and North American partners, are piggybacking on. And then the other big one is data and geo-mapping. I think anyone who's familiar with the continent is aware of how difficult it is to sometimes find people, places, and things because of the fact that a lot of the infrastructure on the continent is not well mapped out. And so the BRI has really been important in sort of updating that. However, there have been challenges of this part. I mean, everybody knows this part because this is the one dimensionality I've been talking about. The fiscal capacity concerns have been there. There are concerns about hidden debt and contingent liabilities. We have been, voicing concerns about the project visibility question. And to be clear, I think the Chinese have listened and are learning. And I think you're going to be seeing, and we are already beginning to see a lot more rigor around that. The environmental question is one that is not going away. China is adding to a problem that had been really started, I think, by European and North American firms. I mean, if you're looking at this overfishing in the West African coast, the first people who were causing headaches really for the Ghanaian and those other countries were European super trawlers. And so to now China has added to that. And then, of course, poor labor practices, which in Africa really upset the publics in terms of the mistreatment of African workers and poor working conditions. So I'm just going to sort of start talking about going forward, the global debt strain and the points that have been made by the previous speaker, a lot of which actually resonated with what's going on in Africa. I mean, first of all, the process will be multilateral often. Sometimes it will be bilateral, but either way, China will be an equal among creditors. I think in the beginning, certainly from Africa, there was sort of this assumption or this push for China to sort of be, second in the pecking order, for China to comply to certain things. And I think there'll be times when that happens, but fundamentally, China is increasingly, I think now, being seen as an equal among creditors. Any sort of debt forgiveness, and I think absolutely right, Prion, there were some announcements made by China, there may be some by others, but there will be an expectation of a soft power return and diplomatic return from African governments because of the great power competition environment that we're in, and also the Ukraine question. I think I completely agree with you, Prion, as well, that there will be probably green climate performance indicators into debt restructuring or whatever arrangement comes up. This is an opportunity for Africa, but also it's going to need to be fairly well thought through to make sure that it doesn't become a bottleneck that prevents Africa from fully leveraging debt restructuring because of the state of green finance and the unique issues that green finance projects have on the continent. Now, the tensions, and this is really my last point, is that, as Europe and North America were trying to create the debt trap narrative argument, arguing that China was pushing Africa into debt, which was not the case, suddenly that all seems to be forgotten, given the G7 infrastructure initiative and Europe's global gateway. There are real questions around how this impacts debt, how this be paid for. Yes, we can have a certain amount of private sector involvement, but I think, as you pointed out earlier, there's sort of limits to that. And that's really one of our big concerns, is that there's a sort of great power push to demonstrate the value add that Europe and North America can bring to the infrastructure question, which is great, because China can't do everything, and Africa has unique needs. How's that going to impact that? I think the war in Ukraine obviously has led to a certain level of reprioritization and spending. We've seen that, but really what it's done is increase political economy tensions on alignment. I think when anyone has been following the Africa story in terms of how African governments voted on the UN resolution against the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I think they were quite surprised. It was almost a 50-50 in terms of half said, yes, this is wrong, and half either abstained, or I think there were one or two that voted against it. And of course, people started blaming China for that. But it's like, no, there's a political economy around the political stances that different African governments are taking. And of course, there's no single story there. Of course, the war in Ukraine has had massive macroeconomic consequences that have trickled into fiscal problems, but we can talk into that later. Part of it is this triple bill to external debt servicing, so we're seeing this massive downward pressure on exchange rates in the context of increased inflationary pressure and rising cost of external debt. It's a real problem for a lot of African countries that now have quite a bit of external debt. And in terms of the export-import composition, if you're looking at the windfall of commodity prices, particularly in fossils and fuels, obviously the African countries that are exporters of fossil fuels, it's a windfall for them. But for other countries, such as much of East Africa, it's having a real impact on our import receipts and adding pressure on the sort of level of dollars that we do need to raise for that alone. So I think I'm going to stop there and allow the conversation to continue. Thank you.
That's brilliant, and so thank you very much. I just wanted to follow up particularly on the analysis of debt trap diplomacy, and I agree very much with what you and others have said. And yet, as you say, this is still around, and in governments and in the media and so on, it's still there. And I just wondered, and I'll come to Gareth just to ask in a minute whether he thinks there's a different kind of dynamic going on in relation to South Asia. But as far as you can see from Africa, what is the reason that this story persists? Because I think that you've described all the consequences it has, but why do you think it's out there? I mean, particularly looking from a US perspective.
Yeah, I think there are two main reasons. I think first is a bit of a hero complex, if to put it quite candidly. It's a symptom of, I think, particularly Europe and North America and the US in particular, seeing itself as a good guy. And the debt trap narrative has almost become a tool for psychological self-soothing, to be like, well, we're the good guys, we're the ones helping Africa, when the reality is that everybody comes with its benefits and challenges. Any sort of African technocrat will tell you that. So there is a bit of a psychological self-soothing mechanism that sort of, and I see it in these stories and just about every major publication, to the point that I almost stopped commenting on those publications. There's a certain narrative that gets clicks, that makes people happy, that's a bit, separate from what's actually going on the ground. So I think that's one really big piece in terms of public perception. I think the other thing is an attempt to sway the minds of African publics, because there is this understanding that a lot of, and just to bear in mind that the average age of an African is 19, right? So you need to separate who you're targeting in terms of mass media versus the people who are actually sitting in decision-making positions. That's, I think, something that is often lost on sort of massive narrative pushes. But there is, the reality that most Africans do read a lot of European, North American, whether it's English or French, and not many people read the Chinese outlets. And so that is understood as an avenue to try and sway the minds of African publics in the context of great power competition. I must say that some of it has had an effect, in terms of Africans, particularly younger Africans, sometimes having a very misguided understanding of what's going on. But I think what I find is that we're now sort of, that's plateauing as sort of more facts are coming to the ground. But I think the people who've never been convinced in the work that I do are leaders in private sector, public sector, and development. They just know that there's no. So I think there is a counterbalance beginning to happen, but I don't think that psychological subsuming impetus is going away from it.
Sure. And how far do you think, in a way, China has contributed to this through the lack of transparency around its lending? Is that it? I mean, that a major factor, do you think, in allowing this to continue in a sense?
Well, I mean, it depends on who you ask. I think from an African government perspective and even the African private sector perspective, China has a right to approach its style however it wants. One of the breaths of fresh air that China brought to the continent was an intellectual approach that was new, interesting, and not really as rooted in sort of bigoted colonial imperialistic tendencies that you'd sort of seen from a lot of European and North American partners, you know. So one of the things that actually allowed China to get big so quickly, and actually explore this in a piece I did for The Diplomat, is that fresh intellectual approach, which means that you have the right to decide how you're going to do it. You know, obviously now they're beginning to see the limits of that. But I think this assumption that European and North America had that you just sort of got to do things the way we do, I think a lot of the people on the continent are like, no, actually, let's see the different approaches that are possible. And then, you know, as time goes on, we'll see the benefits and the problems of each. Because we saw the problems with the European and North American style. One of the big ones being that they no longer wanted to fund infrastructure because, you know, corruption or whatever, they were busy lecturing African governments about that. So China saw that chance linked to this excess capacity to solve that problem with its own style. So I think you really see that in the continent, you know, particularly when you're sitting with people who are sort of making the big financial and policy decisions, they appreciate the multipolarity that the world is going into. You know, Europe is no longer really a bloc since Brexit, you know, frankly. You're seeing a lot of players coming in from India, from Turkey, China is one of them. You're seeing a lot of appetite from Brazil. That creates its own challenges for Africa, but I think you'll find that multilateralism and that multipolarity is welcome.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Gareth, maybe I could move to you now and in a sense follow the same theme, because obviously Sri Lanka was also a country that was very much cited as an example of debt diplomacy, particularly because of the way in which debt was converted into control over port assets and so on. Do you see it the same way as NZC, or do you think it's different in the South Asia experience, and any other aspects that you would highlight in relation to that discussion?
When I think about this question, I think about, I did a lot of work in the early mid-2000s when India started its own aid program, and it's very similar to China's, and it involved lines of credit. And because India, like China, doesn't interfere in the sovereignty of other countries, it does what the other government asks for. And it had a tipping point. It had a couple of tipping points, but the main one was when the president of Ghana said, "Can I have a presidential palace?" And so India said, "Fine, that's what he's asked for." And then there were protests. And then the next step for India was to set up a special cell in the Ministry of External Affairs, just to kind of evaluate, just have a double take on what the other government has asked for, just to make sure this won't get us into sort of trouble down the line. Now, China, we started doing this earlier in this part of the world. It built things. You mentioned the port. There's an airport in the president's constituency. There's a revolving restaurant that doesn't work. There's a conference center that's empty. And my question is not, is it or is it not debt trap diplomacy, but why is there zero due diligence? That would be my way of looking at it. And I think, to be honest, in the case of Sri Lanka, we will find out.
You mean
soon.
From the Chinese side? Why is there zero due diligence from the Chinese side, or?
Yeah, yes,
yeah.
completely. I mean, the World Bank had looked at this port and said this port is not economically viable. You've got Colombo Port just around the corner, and that's where all the ships will go. And major study, I think it was the World Bank, the studies were done, and the Chinese said, no, let's ask for this port, so we'll build it. And in that case, they did control it on a 99-year lease. I think in the case of Sri Lanka, we will find out the answer to this over the next few months, because now Sri Lanka has its IMF agreement. Japan, and I noted the question in the chat, Japan's been charged. Sri Lanka's bilateral debt is between India, Japan, and China. And as has just been said, the Chinese element, estimates of its value vary. We know what the Indian debt is, and we know what the Japanese debt is. So Japan is going to start engaging with China and India on a restructuring package for this bilateral debt. It's China's chance, if you like, to disprove the debt trap thesis once and for all by saying, okay, we'll restructure the debt. rather than say we're going to claim some more assets in Sri Lanka. So I won't answer that question definitively until we find out what happens in the weeks to come.
I mean, one of the arguments, and it may be that either you or Anzetsu want to comment on this, is that part of the reason that, as you say, from a creditor's point of view, you would expect there to be oversight just to make sure that the things you were investing in were such that they could contribute to repaying the debt. I mean, one of the arguments is that in a way there was a very distributed, disorganized, somewhat chaotic approach in terms of Chinese lending. You had many different institutions, at least in the early stages, that weren't properly coordinated and to some extent were competing under the sort of broader sort of banner of delivering the Belt and Road Initiative. But there's also an argument that that is now changing in a sense because of the experience of debt distress. The central authorities are getting a lot more control over what's going on. And in a sense, there's a simultaneous, if you like, coordination in relation to dealing with historic debt, but also potentially this may lead to a more sustainable approach to future Chinese lending. So perhaps I could come to Anzetsu and say, do you have that perception of how China's approach is changing, or would you see it somewhat differently?
I think that's part of it, absolutely. I think people often, I should just start with saying people forget how young China is in Africa. You know, it doesn't have a history of colonization and building railways in the 1800s. Literally, China started serious builds in Africa about 20 years ago. So I think part of it has just been inexperience, just not really knowing what it means to enter into an infrastructure deal with African governments. Now it's got about 20 years under its belt, it's beginning to understand, this is what it means. So I think on the feasibility question, I absolutely agree. They were done poorly, they were done quickly, they were done badly. I think part of it was an experience, part of it was an over accommodation of vested interests, you know. And I think now you're sort of seeing this maturity, and that's why really, in my view, what we're seeing with the Africa-China relationship, we're going into phase 2 of it. Phase 1 has been the 20 years, but let's build stuff, you know, let's add value, let's, you know, do all of this. And now we're going into phase 2, where first of all, there's an understanding to the fallout that comes when you do over-accommodate vested interest. There is an understanding of what happens when project feasibility is done poorly, but there's now also an understanding of the political economy of technocracy in Africa. I think to the point about the feasibility, it's not also always the China's fault. China also gets caught in the regional competition that economies have. In East Africa, everybody wants to have the main port, right? Tanzania's got its port, Kenya has its port, Kenya has 2 ports now, Tanzania has another port. Everybody's trying to fight to raise, you know, traffic. Each government has its projections on how traffic is going to increase through its ports. So I think, again, let us not act as though African governments are sort of infants. They don't understand that these dynamics are going on. There needs to be responsibility borne on both sides. So I do think, as I'm saying, sort of this next phase in Africa-China relationship, you'll see a lot more rigor, not just on the financial modeling and the fiscal modeling, but on the environmental and green side as well. I think China is very alive not only to the reputational risk that it's getting, but also the opportunity that green and climate has for rejigging and reupdating its BRI, leveraging a lot of the digital and technology investments that it's made on the continent.
Great, thank you very much. I want to come back to the interaction between debt and climate finance next, but just before doing so, I want to take some of the questions that we're receiving, and again, encourage any of our participants to please put your questions in the Q&A function. But Gareth, there are 2 that relate specifically to Sri Lanka, as you've identified. One of them relates to the kind of transparency about the process going forward, and in particular, the extent to which the fund program will tackle the underlying issues of corruption and governance and so on in Sri Lanka, which goes back to, in a sense, what we were saying about could this be a start of something different? And then related to that is the prospect, which you've to some extent answered already, around agreement in the creditors committee official creditors committee between three countries, basically Japan, China, and India, which brings in all kinds of different dynamics in a way to what we've seen in the discussion so far in Africa. So because in Africa we've not really had a dominant Western creditor in quite the same way that we do have in Sri Lanka. So any thoughts about basically this process going forward? And maybe do you just want to say a little bit about just where we are now and what the next steps are that you see? Thank you.
I think, as you say, I mean, it's Sri Lanka has to restructure its debts, and a deadline has been given of December. And there's in total 30 billion, give or take, of debt. I think it's complex because there's a political set of questions in the sense of where is that going? Is the country full of protests, etc.? So you've got that bit of the puzzle. Then you've got another bit of the puzzle, which is what's going on with the economy, because all those sort of bits of the economy, aside from potentially remittances going back up, tourism still isn't good. Can the economy start to get back to normal? Can the political situation be okay? And those will feed into what's happening and what the IMF is able to achieve, and what governments are able to achieve. I think it's a very complex sort of cycle where everything affects everything else. And in a country which, like I said at the start, its long-standing problem has been that people don't pay enough tax and expect higher levels of government spending, and they import more than they export. And now it's all come to the rub. And I think it all basically is to have things fallen apart, and do they start to gradually sort of improve, in which case I imagine this process will be tricky, but not impossible. Or does it go down a more negative path? You've got a government devoted, the parliament is made up of people that supported the previous president. The current president comes from a party with one person elected. So I wouldn't focus on necessarily on the transparency, because I think that will be a function of other factors, the politics and the economics. I think it will be really interesting to see what happens. I don't know what will happen, because I think it goes to the wider question of how does Japan manage to engage with India? I would think that would be eminently sort of feasible. With China, it will be very interesting. And I don't know if from the Chinese perspective, there's a sense that it does set a precedent for other distressed Chinese assets, potentially in other countries. And I think that must be part of it. Just to follow up on what was said earlier about China, I had another quick comment that China's approach, I think, has evolved. And I remember talking to some people in Nepal a few years ago, and so it evolved into, we will do whatever you ask for, but you need to make sure it's economically viable. It's not our job to do the due diligence part of it, but you need to make sure. But when you're dealing with lots of countries in South Asia and potentially elsewhere, might be better advised to do a little bit of your own just to check.
Thank you very much. Well, what I'd like to do, we're getting a few more questions in, but before we go to those, and I'll greet them together. And let's see if you could just follow up on your previous comments regarding the interaction between tackling debt distress and at the same time the need for very large amounts of external finance, notwithstanding what you said about domestic finance, but external finance to help deal with the issues of climate adaptation. I mean, how do you think this should be addressed? I mean, there is a point, for example, a lot of people are focused on the idea of debt for climate swaps. So basically that in return for reductions in debt, countries would agree or commit more strongly to particular actions on climate change, and that this would in some way be supported partly by a contribution from private financial institutions, support from the IFIs. But I think, one of the challenges with that is it's not the kind of thing you can do in the middle of a crisis. This is complex. And equally, if you're not in a crisis, you don't necessarily have the creditors in a position where they're willing to make substantial contributions through that route. But any observations on that, the interaction between those two themes would be most welcome.
Yeah, sure, and thank you for that question, because it is something that's I'm very alive to and converse on. I think ultimately it's whose climate priorities will be prioritized. That's fundamentally what is end up going to whether it matters for Africa or not. So I think on one hand, you've also got the supply side that's very much around mitigation, that Africa is focused on adaptation. But I think more importantly, the reality is that climate and sort of climate change in the African context is a function of economic development. It is linked directly to economic development. So the priorities, if you're looking at this from a political economy perspective, African governments are like, yes, climate, that's fine. We already know that. We know our agriculture is already being affected. Our tourism sector is already being affected. Our aquaculture, fisheries, they're already being affected. What we're prioritizing is economic development and how do we deal with climate in that. Whereas I think on the supply side, there's a bit of a different emphasis. So I think the real struggle that we're seeing, and we're going to see the role of COP27 and sort of as people get more serious about this, is how we're going to deal with that mismatch. Where the supply side is sort of like, well, we sort of got the economic development piece figured out in a way. I still think obviously those models could improve. And so we're trying to really look at how does climate create a new lease of life? How do we deal with all this damage? But I think on the other side, on the African side as well, our priority is economic development in the context of climate justice as well. This is the big piece that I always get crickets on. Is like, well, if you're looking at historical contributions, and if you're looking at emissions per capita, climate justice, and the AFDB sort of has written some interesting work around that. So I think we'll end up seeing the seriousness that people have, the level of maturity people are going to bring to the table. But I think the real opportunity for both sides is to build out the adaptation side. One, because it will be a stabilizing factor for African economies. If you look at the GDP and labor exposure to sectors that are directly impacted by climate change, such as agriculture, tourism, fisheries, forestry, though that's a sizable chunk of GDP, and I wrote an article on this by the OECD. So you've got to start looking at climate finance as a stabilizing factor that allows economic stability and therefore fiscal stability to sort of sit on top of that. If that's sort of the view, I think you'll start getting a bit more of an appetite on the African side to start putting serious brains and money behind it. But if it's still the sort of supply-driven mitigation carbon emission conversation, I think we'll just continue just seeing money funneled into renewable energy projects, which sort of have a limit in terms of their usefulness.
Thank you very much. Very, very good points. I mean, do you, just to clarify, are you saying in a sense that one needs to tackle the flow of finance for adaptation first, and in a way that will then make the issues of debt vulnerability easier to tackle? I mean, if that were the case, it would have to be official finance, because I guess the private finance is going to be influenced by the situation. Or do you think actually there's a way of compartmentalizing the two issues?
I think you're going to have to, and I have a piece coming up for COP27, British International Investment. One of the biggest problems, if you're looking at the challenge of climate finance flows, is the project pipeline in Africa. So if you're looking outside of debt swaps, and so the demand side, there's got to be a shift in the intellectual approach from looking for deals to looking at the financial architecture. If you're not going to deal with the fact that from project origination all the way through to disclosure, reporting, measurements, reporting, and all of that, that there are fundamental bottlenecks in terms of how that works. Whether you're looking at mitigation and adaptation, you're going to just sort of sit around and talk about no bankable projects in Africa forever, right? So I think this is really the time, if you're talking about a restructuring of global financial architecture beyond the debt question, and you're actually going to be like, we seriously need to deploy, and there's opportunity for growth in Africa on this, you've got to look at the financial architecture piece. So when that comes out, I'll be happy to share that.
No, that would be really good. Thank you very much. Well, actually, that is gets me to the sort of final point, which I'd like to put to both of you very briefly, and it captures a number of points made in the questions, which is really about the role of the IMF more generally. Now, the interesting thing about the common framework is that it has kept the IMF right at the center of the process of dealing with sovereign debt. I mean, both through its work with the World Bank on debt sustainability, its role in lending into arrears, the role it plays in encouraging official creditors committee to come up with debt treatments and so on. one of our questioners said, well, is there a kind of equivalent IMF debt trap? There's another question about whether China's influence is better or worse than US's influence in relation to debt restructuring. We've obviously seen in the part where the US has had enormous influence, sometimes actually pushing the IMF to do things which weren't necessarily in everybody's interest. But so any quick comments, and if I come to Gareth first and then Anzetse first, on the role of the IMF generally, and perhaps also the role of its kind of key shareholders, particularly the US.
Yeah, I mean, going back to what I was saying earlier, I mean, I'm very interested to see how it plays out with Sri Lanka. I'm very interested to see how they engage. My view of the IMF over the years has it's mostly been playing a role in Pakistan. And it has saddened me when the IMF package appears, none of which have ever got to the end. And the IMF says, you need to cut your development spending. And what Pakistan does not need to do is cut its development spending, it needs to cut its military spending. The IMF understands it's politically unrealistic for it to cut its military spending, so it says to cut its development spending. And I've seen it so many times, and then each of those packages, well, none of the packages has actually got to the end of
And do you think the IMF should say that, even though they know, it's not going to have traction?
Well, if you're going to the IMF because you've run out of money, you're probably spending it on the wrong things.
Right. Okay.
And Pakistan's
Fair enough.
underlying problem has been the role of the army in that country and its inability to develop civilian institutions. Now, so just allowing that to continue, which essentially it does, the IMF gives a package which enables the military to go on. Now, I understand that it would be politically sensitive, but if then they don't get the IMF package, they won't have an army at all.
Yeah. No, I understand.
So
yeah,
that's the country that I followed that's had most engagement with the IMF. Sri Lanka is another country which has lots of IMF packages, and none of them have actually got to the bottom of the very simple: it imports more than it exports, and the government spends more than it taxes.
Yeah. Great.
So you have there's like uber austerity for a short period of time, which is then politically unpopular, and those people then struggle to remain in power, without, certainly in the South Asian context that I can think of, encouraging a shift to the long-term trends, which are the problems. So it's a short-term fix, which is why let's see what happens with Sri Lanka, and let's see what happens because there are other bilateral creditors which are different, and most notably China. And so can there be some kind of positive virtuous circle to both to avert the immediate crisis, but to encourage a longer-term trend towards a more financially stable Sri Lanka in this case? Yeah. Or is it another short-term fix?
Yeah. Well, thanks, Gareth. We're almost out of time, but I do want to give Anzetse the opportunity to express any very quick views either on the fund's role or on the role of its kind of continuing leading shareholders in relation to this.
Yeah, I'll just be very quick because this will evolve. I think really we're going to see this as a test of legitimacy of a lot of the older creditors in Africa. There's been a legitimacy problem in terms of their power in Africa. I mean, whether it's historical, the IMF, the big one is the Structural Adjustment Program. To listen to them then, where did that leave Africa, right? But I think I have seen a bit of a shift also in the approach to some of these funders. I don't think they necessarily behave in the way they did maybe 10, 15 years ago, but ultimately in the context of global debt, etc., whatever action that they take will be viewed through the lens of legitimacy, and whether these are, going concerns that African government should continue to go to. Great. Well, I'm afraid we are out of time. I would first of all like to thank our two experts, Anzetse and Gareth, for some really brilliant contributions. I'm fascinated. I could keep talking for ages, but anyway, we are out of time. Thank you very much. And I'd also like to thank our panelists, our participants for joining us and for their questions they put in. And with that, until our next opportunity, thank you very much, everybody, and see you again in the future. Bye.